This is a recording of class number 2. Hello, welcome to class number 2. This class will consist of a presentation on public personnel administration. We'll continue with our historical overview and spend quite a bit of time today talking about merit system principles and the merit system itself. As well as the evolution of the merit system. So please pay attention, take notes if you need to. Because this is a recorded presentation, the presentation will go much quicker than what we experience in class. So please take notes as you need to. Go back and re-review it and make sure that you capture it. I'll also ask you to, at the end of the presentation, make sure that you email to me 3 questions. 3 questions, the answers to which you would be able to provide if those questions were asked to you during the next class period. So please don't forget to email to me 3 questions after you viewed this presentation. Please email those questions to me by 5 p.m. Wednesday. 5 p.m. Wednesday, that's the day after our scheduled class period. The email address is chiefdrtchiefdrt, as in Robert, T as in Tom, chiefdrt@aol.com. The United States, shortly after its foundation in the 1700s, went through a political era. The political era was actually characterized by what we call patronage and spoils. Under the patronage and spoils system, the public service was universally political. Employees in the public sector, they tended to work for political candidates. They were financially supported by political candidates. You would know that those employed during this political era, which ended roughly around 1890, were friends, were supporters, were comrades of the political candidates who won elected office. The public employment was awarded to political supporters, and there was in fact no separation between politics and administration. The political winners actually ran governmental entities itself, and this was at the federal and generally the state and the local level as well. So hiring and firing during this political era in American history was really based on political loyalty. And this hiring and firing based on political loyalty meant that the politicians would be able to ensure that those who held jobs and positions would remain loyal to them. And in remaining loyal to the politician could remain true to his or her platform, and by that could continue to yield to public opinion and make sure that the decisions that they made were consistent with public expectations. Now, the early federal government was in fact led by well-educated, well-born, prosperous men, so to speak. These well-educated, well-born, well-heeled, so to speak, men formed an exclusive group. And if you think back to the legislation that came onto the scene, even the founding documents for the government were constructed by men who were very well educated, who were very well spoken, and put the right touch onto what they had to say. By 1829, though, this political patronage, this patronage had entrenched itself at the state level. Now, when we say patronage again, that's this system of politics where to the winner went the spoils. The elected official was able to select and hire people based on their political affiliation, based on their political support of the elected candidate. And so when we say patronage, we're talking about that system that's based on politics. So at the same time, the old social and political order uh, was undermined by the modern capitalist and the market system. So capitalism and the ability of markets and public demand to determine the course of governance, the course of reality started to take hold. And in doing so, there was a hit. There was a damage to the old social and political order. There was a growing belief that wealth could be achieved rather than inherited. There was a growing belief that it wasn't just the blood of those early Americans who came over from England who were suited or well suited to perform the work and to run the government. But increasingly, this country of immigrants began to believe that this wealth could be achieved rather than inherited if provided equal opportunity and ambition with the desire to do well, with the desire to work hard, with the desire to learn and be educated, that anybody with those desires could also become wealthy and well-heeled and make good decisions in the government and the people's best interest. So we went through an era in this country of civil service reform. Your textbook refers to this as Civil Service Reform Era 1. It was the first attempt to reduce the influence of politics into government. Uh, this progressive civil service reform movement had multiple political objectives. In fact, this civil service reform movement struck at the very heart of the patronage system. It was designed to destroy major city party machines and bosses in Detroit and Chicago and Boston and other major cities that had become on the political scene dominated by political parties and patronage. Another attempt was the elimination of corruption and inefficiency and waste as long as the burden of taxes or excess taxes in government spending. So this idea about neutral competence, the ability for a person to serve in a public office, the ability for a person to be employed in a public agency or public entity without having to be affiliated with a political party or without being politically partisan. This concept of neutral competence, in fact, began to take shape under the initial effort of civil service reform. So in this effort, the merit principle, which is depicted sort of by this cartoon here, I thought would be kind of funny to add here. You can take a look at it. I won't read it. But this merit principle included the desire to hire and appoint and promote persons to build this personnel system based uh, on the ability of the person being considered to actually do the job. the ability to perform the job, the ability to be successful, not based on his or her political ties or his or her political affiliations, but based on merit. Merit meaning their actual capability of performing the task of the job. And this merit principle also required that promotions and transfers and job decisions be based on some objective measure by objective tests, by competitive exams, and that you could rank order the list. In fact, you could place the people being considered for these jobs in the order in which their test scores fell out, so that the ones who scored the highest would be closer to the top of the list versus the ones who scored the lowest on these competitive exams would be at or towards the bottom of the list. So this merit principle became the uh, the principle with which this civil service reform was identified. The merit system then is the personnel system in which comparative merit or achievement governs each individual's selection and progress in the service, and in which the conditions and rewards of performance contribute to competency and continuity of service. And that's by Arthur O. Glenn Stahl. Now, there are several textbooks on personnel and public personnel systems that were written by Glenn Stahl. So if at your leisure you'd like to learn more about the basics and the guts of civil service reform, you can check out a book in the library or in the public library by O. Glenn Stahl, an early professor and writer on merit system and civil service reform and personnel practices. This is hard to read, but it's an example of a rank ordered list. Under this merit system, a merit system again, where it's an objective system where personnel decisions are made based on a competitive exam, where the focus is ability and capability and not just political orientation. Well, under the merit system, personnel actions are taken on the basis of KSAs, and that's knowledge, skills, and abilities. In some books and some earlier personnel literature, these are called SKAs, but they are the same thing. So these knowledge, skills, and abilities of current employees and job applicants, rather than factors like political affiliation or personality, etc., etc. Under this merit system, then employees are hired and paid based on what they bring to the table, based on their value, based on their qualifications, again, based on merit, based on their ability, and not based on their political affiliation. And under this merit system, employees are assessed and disciplined and rewarded based upon their performance. Assessed, disciplined, and awarded based on their performance. If you look at the lower part of the screen, this link right here, www.mspb.gov/merit system principles.htm. If you go to that link, you'll see the principles of this merit system. Rather than post them here on this presentation, I would ask that you take the time now to go and pull up the merit system principles, review them, and then come back to this recording. So in looking at these merit system principles, these 9 principles outlined on the website that you just viewed, you should note that there are several characteristics of the merit system itself. And these characteristics include open access to jobs, that anybody, regardless of their political persuasion or their political identity, their political affiliation, would have access to jobs based on what they bring to the table, again, based on their qualifications and based on how they compete in a competitive process versus who they know or what their personality is like. So these characteristics include open access to jobs, that the person selected would be competitively determined, whether it's for an entry-level job or a transfer or promotion, that it would be based on an objective, competitive exam, that removal and discipline for failure to perform in the job would be essential versus removal and discipline because of partisan political affiliation or because of partisan political um, uh, or partisan political reason. Uh, the merit system principles again attempted to remove the impact of partisan politics from the public service. Thus, political neutrality of civil servants, both in partisan political activities and in the performance of their work, became essential under this rebirth or this reformation of the merit system. The merit principles then could be identified in cases and case law. These cases are briefly spoken about in your textbook, and so I won't take the time to elaborate on them here in this presentation, but please be sure that you look at your book at the briefs on these cases, but also take some time to go back and reread the cases. Look them up online and read the essence of the cases. They are Rod v. Burns, Brenty v. Finkel, Rutan versus the Republican Party of Illinois. And be sure you understand the essence of these cases and how they espouse the merit principles. Here we see that limited constitutionally acceptable patronage to situations where party affiliation could be demonstrated as a BFOQ did in fact exist. So in other words, political partisanship based on this case law was acceptable if a requirement of the job itself. If being politically partisan would be required in order to perform the job, then it would be considered a BFOQ or a bona fide occupational qualification, BFOQ. And if it is a BFOQ, then it would be considered acceptable as a job requirement. So again, under Civil Service Reform Act, we go to 1883 and the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act created a bipartisan Civil Service Commission, hereafter referred to as the CSC, versus an executive agency, a civil service commission, which ruled and held that entry-level exams must be competitive. The civil service reform reduced the impact of partisan politics, not very much at first. It only targeted a small segment of the federal government, but over the ensuing 40 to 50 year period, civil service reform grew through the federal government and also began to take hold in state and local governments as well. And the civil service reform demanded equal pay for equal work. FDR was a critical piece to the early civil service reform, and under his executive order 7916, he demanded that personnel officers be professionally staffed, and FDR through his executive order actually helped to create the what we would consider the modern personnel system. Most of you who work in the public service are working in a public agency under personnel rules that were envisioned mostly by FDR in 1938 through this executive order 7916, in that personnel officers became professional and modern, that positions became classified based on a job description, based on the actual job task performed, that applicants be required to test, and there would be record keeping, that part of the responsibility of the personnel function would be to formulate policy. To oversee policy, to evaluate policy, to engage in research and development, evaluate programs, to focus on college graduates, to look at personnel administration as a curriculum, to look at it as a field of study, to attempt to educate people on personnel administration, but also to bring more college graduates into the field. But there were a number of criticisms as well. As modern as this concept of personnel administration was, it also suffered through several criticisms. And if you have studied public administration at all, then you should be familiar with the term bureaucracy. Well, personnel offices became, or at least in the pre-war era, became the epitome of bureaucratization. And one of the criticisms of personnel officers and personnel administrations was that they appeared to exist just to enforce rules. They appeared to be more about what we call rulification, writing rules, enforcing rules, and becoming just these monstrosities that were almost solely focused on rules and policies and procedures. And so this bureaucratization was a very important criticism. But then personnel specialists also tended to be really legalistic in applying the rules and policies to their jobs and to their workforces, and personnel specialists themselves became I would say the equivalents of competitive with lawyers. They wanted to interpret policy in very black and white terms, that they lost sight of the human side of the enterprise. And so this rulification, along with this real legalistic approach to personnel administration, started to give the personnel administration business or the function a negative perception among employees and leaders in this arena. So while there was a major attempt to professionalize the public service through professional personnel offices and professional personnel departments, there also was created a merit system dilemma. That dilemma questioning how can civil servants then, who are not subject to election and who are protected from arbitrary dismissal, be held accountable to the desires of the people? How could this in fact be the case? Again, the patronage system was designed to keep the politicians accountable to the electorate. And to the extent the politicians had complete control over the employees in office, they could assure that their will, their desires would be met. And without that control, with an independent uh, employee base who were brought into a system that focused as a principle on neutral competence, the question then arose, how can civil servants who are not subject to election and who are protected from arbitrary dismissal be held accountable to the desires of the people? Well, one one answer was created in the concept of exempt positions that are exempt from merit system protections. These exempt positions serve at the pleasure of an elected official. In every public agency, there are examples of exempt personnel or exempt positions. Typically, they are appointed by the CEO or by the director. They are higher level appointees within an organization, and they are exempt from these merit system protections, meaning that they can be fired or released for any reason. That it doesn't have to be just for cause, but for any reason. They typically will serve at the pleasure again of a CEO or an elected official in your agency or in your office. In my city, the city manager is appointed by the mayor and council. That's an example of an exempt position because they can release him without due process. They can release him because they just don't like him anymore, or because they uh, want to change, and in doing so are not required to go through the merit system procedures or the merit system protections. And so that's an example. These exempt positions then represents an attempt to provide elected officials with legitimate political influence over what otherwise are career civil servants. And we have this classification of government officials who are elected, who are politically appointed, and these career civil servants who are appointed or there are career civil servants in addition to elected and appointed officials who are appointed based on merit, not partisan political affiliation, nor their political philosophies. You look at public employees, and I want to talk just a little bit here about public employees and uh, labor in particular. These public employees um, uh, initially did not have any kind of rights or protection that allowed them to form unions. Within case law, uh, interpreted the Constitution as providing public employees the rights to join and form unions. Now, while public employees had the rights to join and form unions, there was no constitutional right to engage in collective bargaining or to strike against employers. Now, again, this is public employees, not private sector employees. So there's no constitutional right to collective bargaining or striking against employers. There's no reason given, though also legally, that would keep a public employer from bargaining with employee groups. And so we have this issue looking at two different sides. While there was no constitutional right for employees to engage in collective bargaining or striking against employers, there was also no prohibition for employers to bargain with employee groups. And so, because the Constitution essentially is silent on this issue, collective bargaining decisions then are primarily left with state and local governments. And we have several states that are what we call right to work states, and other states are not right to work states. And we see the power of unions and labor and collective bargaining, meet and confer, other forms of associations of public employees, more or less powerful depending on the state level approach to dealing with or bargaining with labor. So public employees may then, under these cases that I have listed here at the top of the page, they may have property and liberty interest in jobs under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth and the 14th Amendment. This is based on the Roth case, based on Perry v. Sinderman. Also, a couple of other cases that are listed here that are 1970s era cases. Public employees may, in fact, have property interest in their jobs and liberty interest in their jobs. These property interests include whatever affects the livelihoods of the individual as defined by the court rulings. These liberty interests include a person's reputation, career prospects, or the ability to find employment elsewhere. These liberty interests may come into play into situations where personnel action may, in fact, affect those areas. We have the Pickering test. The Pickering is a balancing test, in fact, that is discussed. In Pickering v. Board of Education, the court here ruled that Pickering's First Amendment rights had been violated. But while teachers couldn't constitutionally be compelled to give up the right they would otherwise enjoy as citizens to comment on matters of public interest, it was ruled that the state did, in fact, have interest as an employer in regulating the speech of its employees. And so Pickering, in other words, what should be balanced in each case was the interest of the teachers as citizens in regard to their ability to comment against the interest of the public employer in providing services to the public. And so Pickering posited and presented to us a balancing test that is applied in a number of these cases now. What's in the best interest of the public versus the rights of the employer themselves. And so over the past 40 or so years, there has been an attempt to even whittle away even more at the power and the discretion that is afforded to public employers. The Supreme Court has voided or at least meaningfully limited public employees' power and discretion in several areas of the employment relationship. And so public employees may, as a result, no longer be required to take vague and overly broad loyalty oaths, but in fact have some rights and have due process, and will not have to pledge their allegiance to a certain political party or certain politician in order to work and keep a job and be treated fairly. Public employees are also uh, have, as I mentioned, their the restraints on their political behavior based on the Hatch Act is best left to legislative discretion. Now, the Hatch Acts of 1939 and 40, at first was probably passed because of congressional fears that President Roosevelt at that time was really too politically popular and was building a huge base of political support based on growing the number of federal jobs and the number of people holding those jobs. Uh, and the initial 1939 and Hatch Act does apply to most workers in uh, the federal executive branch, but excluded the president and the vice president, along with several department heads uh, in the U.S. The primary responsibility for enforcing the rules of the Hatch Act lie with the U.S. Civil Service Commission initially, and now the OPM, or the Office of Personnel Management, has that responsibility. So the Hatch Act is critical even today because it prohibits the use of a person's job or job title, their official authority, or their influence for the purpose of interfering with an election or affecting the results of an election. And in the case of federal employees in particular, federal employees cannot take part in political campaigns or manage political campaigns at all, and they do so at the threat of a minimum of a 30-day suspension without pay, and maybe even removal from their position based on violations of the Hatch Act. And so again, here's another very important act for you to be familiar with here, the Hatch Act. Go back and review that. Go back and look at the Pickering case, but also be sure you look at these as well. I'll underline here so that you can see them highlighted. Go back and take another look at these cases, and let's see. How much more familiar you can become with these cases and this legislation.